to anyone on the screen. We do now. Order, and welcome to today's session of the Transport Select Committee, where we conclude our scrutiny, pre-legislative scrutiny of the draft Rail Reform Bill. Our first panel today, we are joined virtually from Edinburgh. Before we begin, can I just invite Minister for you to state your name and position, please?
Good morning. I'm Fiona Hyslop. I'm the Cabinet Secretary for Transport in the Scottish Government. I'm coming to you from Transport House in Glasgow, and lovely to be with you.
Edinburgh. Marvellous. Well, very, very welcome, and we're grateful for your time and evidence this morning. Before we get into some more detailed questions, could you just initially briefly outline how the railways in Scotland sit currently in the national framework, and what powers that you don't have that you currently seek?
So the current position in Scotland is that we have executive devolution in relation to certain rail matters, and that's been the case since the Railways Act in 2005, but we still have to operate within the constraints of the GB industry structure and the prevailing UK legislation, which is clearly reserved. What we do have is powers to set a strategy for the exercise of our functions in relation to railways and railway services, to specify outputs which help support the delivery of that strategy, and to provide funding. And I would point out for CP7, that's £4.2 billion, which is a significant amount of our budget. And since 2016, the Scottish ministers can invite tenders for all rail passenger franchises from public sector bidders, and we exercise those rail functions through our national transport strategy. We've got a rail decarbonisation action plan, rail freight strategy, including separate freight growth strategies, and in relation to the infrastructure, we can support that to ensure that ScotRail and Caledonian Sleep are both under now public control through our ownership through operator of last resort arrangements. We do engage constructively with the Department of Transport on cross-border services currently, and with the freight sector. We operate with an agreement, a Scottish Rail Alliance, which is a Team Scotland approach. But what we do want to see, and in terms of progress, is we already have got a very good integrated track and train arrangement through those agreements between Network Rail and ScotRail, managed through the Scottish Rail Alliance and our agreements. That is a good system. Currently, we do it despite the current arrangements. In fact, we've been pretty creative within where we are in terms of those constraints. But what we really want is devolution of our rail services to enable that integration of track and train, which everybody sees is desirable. Is what we put into the rail review, but unfortunately in the draft bill you're currently looking at, that devolution approach has not been replicated in the draft bill you have in front of me. I hope, Chair, that gives you some kind of outline.
Well, that's very helpful, thank you. And as the bill in its current form, what does it change from your current situation?
So in terms of our current situation, it actually will complicate things and make things more difficult for us and more remote, and take away and in fact damage the devolution that we currently have in terms of what's been provided. What you see in front of you is a draft bill which will deliver for England. It is a more integrated and aligned railway, bringing together those responsibilities for track and train into a single body, which is a step forward for the industry there. However, in Scotland, what we face with this bill is the prospect of unnecessary and actually inefficient complication of Scotland's railway, with a new body. I think in terms of being more distant from Scottish ministers, there won't be any statutory responsibilities. So what would happen is, with the bill as it stands, it would mean that the new body would have responsibility for track and cross-border services only. Private companies would continue to operate freight services, and Scottish ministers would remain responsible for setting the strategy in Scotland, the funding, as I've said, quite considerable, and providing passenger services. But the draft bill only allows for greater integration in Scotland if Scottish ministers delegate or give away our rail franchising functions to the IRB, and that body itself would not be directly accountable to the Scottish Parliament or the taxpayer, and which Scottish ministers would have very little control over, and particularly no statutory powers to direct or influence. And I think that's where your committee comes in your scrutiny and your recommendations as what might make this a better position than we are currently.
Thank you, and my colleagues will want to pick up on some of those points in a moment. But can I just conclude my questions for now by asking what engagement did you have with the Department for Transport before this bill was published in its current form? Did you put forward alternative suggestions and those were rejected or just not acknowledged? What was the engagement pre this bill's publication?
So in terms of our engagement, clearly we submitted evidence to the Williams Chaps review. We set out clearly our preferred option of devolution. In terms of cooperation, I think I've already said in my remarks that our officials in Transport Scotland have regular dialogue with the Department of Transport, and I understand you have evidence about to take place from your minister, Hugh Merriman. I actually met with him on this issue only a few weeks ago as well. And so we have had good engagement, but as sometimes happens, as you might appreciate in terms of devolution, Whitehall and decisions that are made, we haven't had evidence of results. So I would say it's a little result from good engagement.
Thank you. Gavin, if I could turn to you next.
Thank you very much, Chair. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. Good to see you in Glasgow, because as you know, West is best. But thank you very much. We heard, as you may have seen from the Welsh Government yesterday, who were making similar arguments in terms of the complication and lack of accountability that this bill, with regard to the Scottish and Welsh governments with the new arrangements, this may, I suppose, place upon the current arrangements. Clearly, from both a Scottish and Welsh perspective, both you have argued and the Welsh Government argued that further devolution, or full devolution of rail services, I should say, is obviously the optimal solution for both the Scottish and Welsh governments. But if I could stray back into the current bill, short of full devolution, how do you think that the bill could be amended to better enable both the both devolved governments to have accountability with regard to services and infrastructure in Scotland?
So thank you for that question, and we do reflect on the evidence from the Welsh Government, and there's similar issues, but I would point out that clearly we have already got some degree of devolution within Scotland, so our system is different from the Welsh. So in the atmosphere of trying to be constructive and to help the committee provide solutions to what I think is an irony, where you have a situation where we want to see integrated track and train, but the proposals for the UK is actually counterproductive and is a step backwards for Scotland. So we need to find ways of how we might improve that. We've got there's probably about 3 amendments which I think, if the chair is happy for me to go through, I think would potentially help the situation, however limited that might be, reflecting that I do think full devolution is more desirable. And bear in mind, I think the UK government, and you might want to ask them, and I think certainly my discussions with Network Rail, the example of Scotland and the experience of Scotland is what they want to import into the English system, because we have been successful. And I would say that, even as of this morning, our performance rate is at 95%. And I think in England it's at 91%. So, we have got successes that want to be replicated elsewhere, but there's in danger that you're throwing the baby out with the bathwater in terms of what's happening with this draft bill in terms of Scotland. And I think it's quite telling that the UK government has seconded Alex Hynes, who was the managing director of Scottish Railways until fairly recently. He's been seconded into the Department of Transport to help the UK government guide its way forward for GB Rail. But going to your point about how can we improve this? So I think if we could provide Scottish ministers with the power to issue direction or guidance to the IRB in relation to activities which Scottish ministers have responsibility to fund. I would also seek a provision requiring the Secretary of State to consult with Scottish ministers prior to the Secretary of State issuing any direction or guidance. Now, that would provide greater accountability to Scottish ministers. That's within the current bill, but also ensure that Scottish ministers were consulted, which is remember, we are anticipated that we will be the primary funder of the IRB in Scotland, I think is a reasonable request. The second amendment, which I think would be helpful, would be to amend the provision which would give the Scottish ministers the power to enter into an agreement with the IRB for the IRB to exercise on ministers' behalf any of their, I quote, relevant, the relevant franchising functions, because I think this is a key aspect. It's one that I think the Welsh Government had quite strong views about when they gave you evidence. So that the Scottish Secretary of State's permission is not required to revoke any such agreement. So without this, there's a danger that the risk would remain that our current devolved responsibilities providing passenger services would not be returned depending on the Secretary of State's view at the time. So that agreement to transfer franchising functions to the IRB for us looks like a one-way street. And I think that's a problem. And then finally, in terms of improvements, I'm sure that as the bill is finally published, there'll be others as well. But to give you a sense, and there might be reflections the committee already have, this one is, I think, pertinent to how we should do business between two governments to ensure that we have that cooperation. Is to the third one would be to amend the Secretary of State's power to amend acts of the Scottish Parliament by regulations in consequence of the provision made in the bill, that Henry VIII power, so that consent of Scottish ministers would be required. Now, bearing in mind that it's convention, as you will all know, that the UK Parliament would not normally legislate in devolved areas without the consent of the Scottish Parliament. That doesn't apply to secondary legislation. And if this a lot of these powers in this bill is going to be through secondary legislation, such a consent requirement would seem appropriate here. So I'm still absolutely firm that our preferred route is full devolution of these powers. But in short of that, I do think we've provided some kind of evidence and suggestions that would help the committee in the deliberations to make sure that devolution is not damaged by this bill, which actually I don't think the UK government currently or whatever form the new UK government takes would want to do.
I'll cycle back to full devolution in a minute, Cabinet Secretary, but you've just brought up the issue around the delegated franchising functions. You've obviously given a solution to make it better than it currently is drafted, but is that delegation, the power to delegate, is that something that is actually desired by the Scottish Government?
We wouldn't need it, we wouldn't want it. We'd prefer to have our own powers to make our own franchising decisions. That's what was given to the Scottish Parliament back in 2005. And that was operated at that time by the Scottish Executive, which was formed by a Labour Liberal Democrat coalition. So, in terms of what I was saying about going backwards, actually, without making sure that we've got our own powers to make our own decisions, and actually our preferred option would be for us to be able to make in a straightforward way decisions about taking public control, public ownership of our railways, because we have demonstrated in Scotland that we can have good cooperation between track and train, that we can get good value for money for our investments. We've got electrification, which is now 76% of journeys in Scotland are on electric train. And in terms of our improvements, we are building and securing. We've done 16 new stations since we came into power, and we've also just about to open, and I can't go this evidence session without saying it, next week we're seeing the official opening of the Levermouth rail link, which restores rail that has been closed for 50 years, opens up an area of Fife for jobs, employment, and tackling lots of issues. So we don't want that diminished in any way. And that's why we want to have the powers to do this in a straightforward way, which is why the straightforward powers of devolution would allow us to do that. Obviously, cooperation would continue to need to exist. We recognise the important role of the safety regulations. Indeed, I just had a meeting yesterday with the board of the ORR, so we're acutely aware of collective responsibilities, cross-border freight issues. But for us to continue, if we want to put the passenger first, if we want to put our economy and our industry first, then actually making sure that, the powers and the legal context supports that, it makes common sense for devolution of those powers to be the optimum solution. Short of that, I think the committee will need to wrestle with a bill that is yet to be presented formally, and any support the committee can give to the best practice that's been achieved. And I hope you could draw on some of the best practice that we've seen in Scotland to help inform what does good look like. We know the UK government wants to replicate what they see in Scotland. There's always room for improvement, but I think Scotland is in a strong place, and we'd like to share our experience. A lot of the different parts of the UK want to learn about Scotland, and we're happy to share that experience with them as well.
Indeed. Well, you mentioned Leavenmouth there. I happened to pass through the new Motherwell station on Saturday on my way to an even better football game as well. It's that's a fairly significant achievement at that station as well. But you alluded to it, but in terms of that delegation function, as it currently is drafted in the draft bill, is that compatible with the devolution settlement as is?
Currently, no.
Fairly straightforward answer. And I think in one of the amendments you suggested, perhaps you put forward a way forward here. But the question I'm going to ask is, how should the relationship between yourselves, the Scottish Government, the IRB, and the Secretary of State for Transport down here need to be structured to be workable moving forward?
Well, I think the problem with the bill just now, it gives a great deal of power to the IRB, which is not statutorily accountable to the Scottish Government. So that's why one of the amendments is to make sure that they have a statutory responsibility to Scottish ministers for the services that we provide. Now, remember, that's currently for the next period £4.2 billion. This year it's £1.6 billion. So we'd need to have that statutory responsibility to us. And the logic of the bill currently is there is one accountability, and that one accountability is to the Secretary of State for Transport. And with the best will in the world, however good the Secretary of State for Transport is in whatever government, they are not going to be on top of the issues in Scotland that are operating in a devolved space. And I wouldn't expect them to. So I think the idea that the sole statutory relationship is solely with the Secretary of State for Transport is the fundamental weakness in the draft bill.
Okay, and I just come to my final question, Chair. You've made the point yourself that the proposals are essentially mirrored on Scotland's journey thus far, and in many ways it's almost completing that journey for the English rail network. But since the franchises have come back under public control, there has been, when I speak to people in industry in ScotRail, there has been a change in ethos and approach with regard to how the services are delivered, like a renewed purpose, as it were, not just focused on the train services itself, but looking at it in a more holistic kind of public policy objective setting. How might this impact that approach?
Well, I think it weakens it. I think it makes it more disparate rather than integrated. I think you touch on the importance of a whole industry approach, and that's not just Network Rail and ScotRail currently working together. That's actually the whole industry as well, in terms of how we can work together. And that also, and I think this is going to be an important point, and I'm not sure if you're raising competition, because I've got a view on that as well, but we also want to have multimodal integrated transport systems, not just rail systems. So you talked about Motherwell Station. Part of the major investment to Motherwell Station was to align the bus and active travel with rail, same at Leavenmouth. So we need to make sure we've got a more integrated transport system as a whole. and therefore the more remote and distance you have an IRB from the operation of transport in Scotland, the more difficult that becomes. So I think that's a challenge, and I do think we need to think of our transport systems not just as modes to get passengers from A to B. They can be absolutely instrumental in economic activity, tackling poverty by helping support jobs. I know that because one of the major investments in Scotland was the Bathgate Airdrie line, linking a second line between Glasgow and Edinburgh, and highly successful. And that ethos point you talked about, we have chosen to take into public control our rail provision. It's also led to 400 more staff in our railway services since we took over, and also currently there is no industrial action in Scotland, which is a stark difference to what you're experiencing in England. We clearly I need to recognise there's cross-border rail issues that affect Scotland, but there is a different ethos. Everybody's pulling together in the same direction. I think it would be I think it would be a retrograde step for this bill to go through as it is currently drafted, and we do look to your committee to provide your collective wisdom as to how that might be addressed.
With that pressure, thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Carl, you wanted to come in.
Thank you, Chairman. Cabinet Secretary, you hear your message about wanting complete devolution for Scotland, and obviously there's cross-border services already. And if you look at LNER going up the East Coast, and I represent Lincoln, which gets some of those services. If you had full devolution, would you not see that the Secretary of State for Transport in England would want better services for English passengers, and therefore might not services such as direct services from London to Scotland then terminate at Edinburgh and come back down, obviously increasing capacity for English passengers? And what would happen for Scottish passengers at that point?
I can't imagine any Secretary of State for Transport in the UK wanting to cause such difficulties. And indeed, under the current operation, we have to work collectively with the UK government. And of course, if you take freight, for example, for Scottish goods getting to the continent, via rail, of course we have to have cooperation. And currently, we try and do that. There are some issues, not to stray into the problems of HS2, but obviously in terms of the consequences of that, how do we ensure that we have the freight provisions that we need? Now that happens under existing arrangements, let alone under the new arrangements. So I think your criticisms and concerns could equally apply to the current situation under the current Transport Minister. One of our challenges is about electrification provision in the north of England, slowing down our trains and slowing down delivery. And that, again, is where I've already had discussions with your transport ministers about how we might be able to try and improve that. I think that's really important. So that cooperation would still need to exist, whatever form, whatever shape we have, whether it's the current situation or whether it's a new one. So I'm not sure the premise of that. I notice you're from Lincoln and we're in the Thatcher room. I might want to point out I was educated in Grantham, so I'm very acutely aware of some of the issues facing that part of the country as well. Thank you.
Thank you for your answer. I'm just conscious, obviously, there's passengers in England, there's passengers in Scotland, and I heard the message that we've got to put passengers first. It's just that neither side probably wants to or should want to put their passengers above the others. But thanks.
Okay, and if I maybe put it back to you, I mean, I know you've had criticism the IRB might give preferential treatment to those either talks or those services that are within the direct power of the Secretary of State at the expense of others. So I think that tension is something that you'll want to explore further as well, I'm sure.
Thank you.
Thank you. Just a supplementary to Carl's question. Is in the amendments that you've proposed, would there be a difference between services that operate wholly within Scotland and the cross-border ones? Particularly when it comes to investment. So say, for example, there was a proposal to upgrade the signalling on the West Coast Main Line in Cumbria and Lancashire. That spending would be wholly within England, but obviously hopefully benefit to the cross-border services on the West Coast Main Line. So in the amendments you propose, would you want to differentiate between services wholly operating within Scotland and the cross-border ones?
So there would need to be sensible arrangements for agreements. Currently, we have a memorandum of understanding with the Department of Transport. There currently is a framework agreement, as you will know, between the Secretary of State and Department of Transport and Network Rail. There are provisions currently within that framework agreement for the cooperation between Scotland and Network Rail. We set out, remember, we've just submitted that, the high-level specifications for a railway system for CP7, and a lot of that is what our expectations are. There will be differences. We haven't mentioned climate change. I think Scotland is suffering more from dare I say, wet weather. That's not a great advert for Scotland. It's been glorious so far in May. But actually, the storms that we've had and the waterlogging, etc., there is an acute issue for us in relation to that. On the cross-border issue, that's not just an issue for the new arrangements. It's currently what we need to do now. And actually, Scotland is already investing, and I'll correct the record if I'm wrong on this, feeder stations in Portobello and indeed in different other parts of Scotland to help precisely to help with the support of cross-border rail. And what we need to do is actually get the UK government currently, under the current system, to do similar investments to help us. And I think that's one of the concerns I have from the rail industry, is they have to go through parts of the north of England, which is not good for freight and rail in England, but isn't good for freight and rail passengers in Scotland either. So whatever arrangement you have, you're still going to have those issues. And under full devolution, actually, it would be far more formalised. Indeed, as I know from, I've had now 17 years of different experience in the Scottish Government, that when we're working with the UK Government, it's actually easier to work when it's clearly devolved and clearly reserved. It's the grey issues that cause the issue. And unfortunately, I think this bill, as it's currently drafted, is definitely in this very grey and murky area. But I'm sure your committee will shine some light on it when you finally report.
Thank you. That's very helpful. We're coming to the end of our session. I'd just like to give you an opportunity to put on the record any other points that you haven't already covered this morning or in your written evidence.
So this bill isn't published yet, so we need to see what the formal position is when it is finally published. I do think that there will be serious issues around legislative consent. We already have a difference of opinion as to with the UK government as what would require that. I will follow that up in writing, I think, to you, to identify the current areas we would have concerns with. And I know, because I was deputy convener of our own transport committee, actually getting all this sorted right up front so we don't have delays in terms of legislative memorandum, etc., between two governments would be really helpful to get that all sorted up front. I do think we can provide information of the successes, and I do think there is something very serious here, that depending on the shape of the UK government coming in, that there needs to be an option within this bill to allow Scotland to have the option to retain public control of ScotRail, because it is successful, it's supporting our industries, it's supporting our passengers, and we are demonstrating that it can be a success. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And the purpose of our inquiry is to try and identify and resolve any difficulties within the draft bill before it gets presented to Parliament as a formal bill. But thank you very much indeed for your time and evidence this morning.
Thank you very much, Chair.
Order. Thank you.
The proceeding is currently suspended. 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 The proceeding is currently suspended.
Order, and welcome to our second panel on our final day of scrutiny of the draft Rail Reform Bill. Before we get into questions, could I just invite our witnesses to state their names and organisation, please?
Yes, good morning. My name is Peter Lord Hendy of Richmond Hill, and I'm the chair of Network Rail.
Thank you.
And I'm Andrew Haines, and I'm the chief executive of Network Rail, and I'm also the lead for the Great British Railways transition team. Thank you.
Very grateful for your time and evidence this morning. If I could start off, Andrew, with I think the question I put to you when you appeared before the Public Accounts Committee. In the evidence we've received, there's a great wish that GBR does not become Network Rail 2.0. How do you intend, particularly given that Network Rail Infrastructure Limited is going to be the corporate entity, how do you ensure that that culture does not just transfer over?
Well, I think, as I said, when you posed that question to me at the Public Accounts Committee, it would be a criminal waste of an opportunity if we replicated that culture. The railway culture is not fit for purpose across the piece at the moment. It's a culture that's been driven by contracts which have driven adversarial relationships where you spend more time blaming each other rather than serving the needs of passengers and freight users. And we as Network Rail play a large part of that because the incentives on us currently drive us to manage and comply with those contracts. Now, we believe that the integrated rail body is the best solution to that because it makes the infrastructure subservient to the whole system. And rather ironically, integrating it within Network Rail within that system actually is a fundamental plank of that, because it means that no longer does the infrastructure manager sit outside of the service provision worrying just about asset and its contracts. It actually has responsibility for delivering to passengers and freight users in a way that it doesn't currently have under its license. So the fundamental thing that will change the culture is actually making the profit and loss account that delivers for the end users of the railway the central plank of how you manage.
Thank you. And just on using NRIL as the corporate entity, is that the best way of creating GBR? Or are there other models that we could explore, such as setting up a new parent company of which Network Rail Infrastructure would be a subsidiary?
I think there are two things. That one is just the sheer logistics. Network Rail, the railway infrastructure, whatever name you give it, is a big beast. There are over 40,000 of us. There are millions of assets. There are thousands of contracts. So you could set up an entirely new entity, but you would create a huge amount of bureaucracy to transfer all of those people and assets and contracts to that new entity, and you would transfer them all, because all of those contracts would innovate, all the assets would innovate, and all the people. So you could go through the pretense of creating something very different, but all of those things come. And importantly, if you create an infrastructure subsidiary within that body, you risk perpetuating the fundamental issue we currently have, which is you allow infrastructure engineers to manage infrastructure engineering and not look at service to users, which is why we're so passionate about actually the infrastructure being subservient to the overall users of the network. If you create an isolated silo within GBR that just looks after infrastructure, you risk perpetuating all of the negative behaviours that we've seen over the last 30 years.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Can I add? I mean, it seems to me to be the counterfactual of this, if you don't want to make NRIL into GBR, is that, as Andrew says, you leave the infrastructure in a separate organisation, and if you think it's introspective now and you don't think that the contractual circumstances of Network Rail properly serve passengers and freight, it's even more likely, if you leave it as it is, that it will continue to look inwards and not outwards. And certainly my previous experience running an integrated transport organisation, although a smaller one in London, is that although the infrastructure is a very important part of running a railway, it ought to be subservient to the desire to serve passengers and freight properly at the right cost to passengers and the taxpayer.
If I could just say one other thing on my own personal experience is majority in the train operating field. 3 of my 5 regional managing directors, are train operators by background. The reason that hasn't resulted in a transformational culture on Network Rail is because the culture is a function of the incentives and the contracts we work to.
Thank you. Just before I turn to some colleagues for questions, we've heard from other witnesses that this bill is just one piece of a much wider jigsaw. Are you broadly content with the approach the government's taking, that this bill is small and focused, and much of the other detail, the other infrastructure for reforming the rail industry will sit around it? Is that the right approach, or would you like to see more specified in the bill itself?
So that's a great opportunity for me to say on our behalf that actually we are totally committed to the reform of the railway. I had the misfortune to be chair of Network Rail in the timetable crisis of May 2018, which was at least partially our responsibility. And I think that the work that's been done since then persuades us without a doubt that rail reform is the right thing to do. So we're totally committed to it. We're delighted to see the bill. Our only disappointment is that it won't go through in this parliamentary session. And it is absolutely the right thing to do. So the government's chosen a short bill. It would be extraordinarily hard to blame them for that. And actually, in view of that, there are things which then need to be done in secondary legislation, which no doubt you'll come on to. We don't mind a short bill. What we really care about is fixing the railway for its customers, and if this is a contribution to it, this will do. This is great, frankly.
Thank you, Carl.
Thank you, Chairman. Leaning on from some of the Chairman's earlier questions, you both have vast experience within the rail sector and transport per se, but Andrew, maybe yourself in your previous roles. The Strategic Rail Authority in its infancy was maybe handcuffed by the Department of Transport and ultimately the Treasury, but just prior to the 2005 general election and post, it was probably getting to grips with what it was tasked to do. Have you learnt any lessons from that or taken anything forward to where we are today and what you'd like to see happen in the near and middle future?
It's a really good point, because the Strategic Rail Authority had a lot going for it, but it wasn't able to direct the infrastructure. It could make recommendations, it produced studies, it had a long-term strategy, but the infrastructure entity was entirely divorced from it, and that, I think, was the fundamental flaw in that. And so the big lesson we've learned is this is an integrated rail body, the first time since 1994 that you'll be able to look at the system as a whole and say, what outcomes do the taxpayer want? What are passengers and freight users demanding of the railway? What is the best way to use public and private sector resources to bring that together?
Lord Hendy?
Yeah, I mean, Andrew's right. If I cast my mind back to the Underground, which was part of TfL, which I ran for nearly 10 years, running the infrastructure with the aberration of the PPP, which didn't last long enough to get into the culture of any organisation, actually what you do is you manage the train service for the benefit of the customers. You can make many changes with either the trains you've got and or the staff on the stations and the drivers themselves, and only if you need to spend money on infrastructure would you do so. One of the difficulties that we face is that our solutions necessarily have to be infrastructure solutions because we're an infrastructure organisation. Infrastructure is the last place you should go when you've exhausted the other cheaper and quicker methodologies of altering the service for the benefit of passengers and freight. And I've found it very strange, and I still find it strange, that we talk about solutions only in infrastructure terms and a bit in signalling terms because we're responsible for the operation of that, when actually we should be solving the issues that occur about the management of the railway in an integrated way, of which infrastructure is only part. It's an important part, it's a costly part, it needs to be looked after, otherwise we prejudice the safety of passengers and our own employees, but it's only part of the solution.
bit like the Circle line, which isn't really a circulatory route anymore, it's a teacup service.
Well, yes, I think that's one of the few service changes that in my time I did actually discuss with the Mayor, but I think that the other principle which you would want to see here is that actually the railway was run by a competent and effective management at the direction of the government because it's public money, but actually the detail of it should be managed as an integrated railway, locally and regionally run to the benefit of passengers.
I only put that because I worked on that myself when I worked for you, but you wouldn't have known me that thing.
that was one of the more controversial changes, to change something called the Circle line into something that wasn't a circle, but it didn't.
It worked.
Yeah, I think the frying pan line wouldn't have gone down quite so well.
May I just add maybe one more point, but reflections on the Strategic Rail Authority. Something we lose sight of is that that was abolished in sort of 2004. Even post-COVID, we're now about 80% up on rail utilisation compared to where we were in 2004. And a lot of the issues which have driven this legislation are a function of a network that is much more congested now, both in terms of track capacity and train utilisation. And so the ability to optimise the system is much more acute. It was less of an issue for the SRA because there was more spare capacity. I was running South West Trains, one of the biggest train operators at the time, but we had nothing like the levels of congestion either on track or on train than is currently faced, even with the pandemic drop-off, and that's why this bill is very timely.
Yeah, it's a major constraint. That's why I brought the question to the Scottish representative in the panel before. That's certainly on the East Coast. It's a real problem and an issue. It's not going to go away. Thank you.
Fabian.
Thank you, Chair. Gentlemen, that leads us to the next question, which I think is relevant to the replies you've already given. Are you confident that the IRB will have sufficient independence from the Secretary of State to carry out its stated aims? Lord Hendy.
So it seems to me to be quite inevitable that the government puts a huge amount of public money into the railways. It's naive to suppose that actually the railway cannot be run to some degree by at the direction of the Secretary of State. I can't see how you could possibly suppose that we would think that it should be so independent somehow that it should be spending public money, huge sums of public money on things without accountability directly to the Secretary of State. I mean, in the end, it depends on the attitude of the government and the Secretary of State and the competence of the management. As I said earlier, I've got some experience of running a transport organisation at the direction of a politician, but spending public money. It seems to me that the bill, as we've read it, allows us the opportunity of sufficient flexibility to do this. It depends on the Secretary of State and the Department not wanting to take decisions in the detail in which they currently do so. So you would not expect to be directed on the length of individual trains, the times they left or the stations they stopped at, but you would expect direction about what the government expects of the railway in terms of its effect on the economic life of the country. And one of the reasons why politicians of all parties are so keen to invest in the railway is because it's so crucial for economic growth, for housing and for jobs. So would we expect a lot of interaction? Of course we would. Would we expect to account for what we're spending? Of course we would. Would we expect the Secretary of State to look at the business plan, which is rightly specified in the legislation, and decide whether it accorded with the government's aims for transport? Of course we should. And you might meet people, maybe not in these sessions, we certainly do, who say, why are these politicians interfering so much in the railway? And the answer is, A, because it's important to the economy, it's crucial to the economy and for economic growth, and B, because we spend a huge amount of public money and we should be accountable for it, and it's the Secretary of State to whom we are accountable.
So thank you for that. So Mr. Haines, has the bill got the balance right? Because obviously you need operational independence, but clearly you're accountable. It's a balance, isn't it? So does the bill have the balance right? And are you convinced? I think Lord Hendy mentioned earlier he's not sure that the bill's going to become law by the end of this Parliament. Do you have a view about that?
For me, the bill has the right balance because It requires the body to set out a business plan, which is the basis for that agreement, if you like. It gives power for the Secretary of State to issue statutory directions, but we know that generally speaking, Secretary of State, in all departments have quite a high threshold before they do that, and they have to act in consultation. Ultimately, as Peter says, it'll come down, I think, to two things. Partly, three things. First, the appetite of the of ministers at any particular time. And interestingly, at the moment, the current Secretary of State and the Shadow Secretary of State have both said the level of political intervention is unhelpful. So I don't think there's any sort of political dispute about that. Secondly, it'll depend upon the competence, clearly, of the body, doesn't it? No politician is going to step back and watch people fail and do crass things. And related to that, the third one is, I think we've got to demonstrate when things go awry, as they will do in the railway, that they're dealt with effectively. A lot of the current level of intervention is not enshrined in legislation in the 2004 Act. It's been a consequence of things which have gone wrong in the system. So the ability of the integrated rail body to lead competently and self-heal, I think, will be critical to the confidence in politicians.
And perhaps I can just add from the experience. I mean, the Williams review arose from the May 2018 timetable change. I was a witness to the then Secretary of State trying to wrestle between the different parts of the railway, trying to find out what part they played in quite serious economic damage caused in two parts of the country by the failure of the railway to run an efficient and reliable service. And I think that's an appalling position to put an elected politician in. He should have been able to say, you're in charge of the railway, what are you going to do to fix these problems? And the fact that nobody in the railway at any level could account for the total performance of the railways is I think, the starting point of where we've got to here. Now, as Andrew says, you can't overemphasise the fact that the management of the integrated rail body has to be competent, and that's a judgment that politicians will have to make in appointing the management, but it should then expect the management to be able to run the railway and account for its performance.
This bill adequately begins that process?
We think so.
Yes.
Thank you. Just to ask supplementary to Fabian's question, there will always be times where a choice in investment in the railway will be ultimately a political one. There won't be the budget to do everything that everyone wants. So hypothetically, let's say there's some investment in the West Coast Main Line that creates an extra peak time path up the line. That could be used for freight, it could be used for a commuter service to Milton Keynes, it could be used for an additional express intercity service. And different parts of the country and members and councils will lobby for their preferred outcome. Is that a scenario in which the Secretary of State could legitimately intervene, or should it be left for the IRB to make the best industry choice?
So let me give you a parallel from my Transport for London days. We had a long-term business plan which set out transport interventions needed to deliver the London plan. This is a common, a consistent process set down by the 1999 Greater London Authority Act. The consequence of that was a list of capital interventions into the railway and other transport systems in London, which we diligently went away and looked at what needed to be done to achieve them, how much it cost, how long it took, and what the business case was. That was a list that was then presented to the Mayor, quite rightly, because he was accounted to, he had to pay for it in effect, and he made some choices on it. We presented it in order of the best things to do for the business case, for the money and in the timescales arrived. I think those are reasonable political choices. I think what I would want, if I were the Secretary of State, is for that list to be ordered in a way that enabled me to see clearly what the right choices might be. And we might, if we were the management, we might go and argue for some of them it's my experience that both mayors of very different political parties chose different things on the list. They didn't always choose number 3. They did generally choose numbers 1 and 2 because we could prove that they were the best interventions. Now, I think it would be a bit of a shame if in hypothetical circumstances we were to be arguing with the Secretary of State about one train path, but I would like to think that whoever was in charge could look at this list of investments in the railway and make a rational choice about the best ones to do for the economic future of the country. And of course it would be more difficult because it would be geographically based from Wick to Penzance, to the extent to which the devolved authorities were involved in their own choices. And there will have to be some choices made, and I would think that they should be politically viewed, because these are the ones at the top of the list will be vast sums of money, won't they?
And the very specific example you gave was of where the effect for the taxpayers invested in creating new capacity. Seems to me that's entirely reasonable, that if there is a publicly funded investment, then it's used for the purposes that was intended. The irony of the current situation is that the taxpayer invests in infrastructure upgrade but has no ability to be satisfied it will be used for that purpose, because the way that the funds are allocated, is entirely contractualised, and there is no guide in mind to optimise the use of the capacity.
Thank you. And just before I turn to a colleague again, would you like to see the circumstances in which a Secretary of State can intervene listed in the bill, or would that not be helpful?
I mean, I wonder how much of that you can do. If you look at the past 5 years, we've had COVID, which was an extraordinary, thing in the country of the nature of a world war or something. I don't know whether I'm clever enough to draft a list that's exhaustive. I don't recall in previous days that the British Railways Board ever had such a list. And certainly there was no list when I ran Transport for London. The Mayor asked me what he wanted, not too frequently, but enough to make sure that he was in charge and he knew what was going on. I would find that difficult. Andrew, you've got a different view?
No, I would find it difficult. I think, not least as a taxpayer, the idea that the public would be investing so heavily in the railway system, but that there wouldn't be meaningful conversations to hold an integrated rail body to account. I think it would be artificial, because the idea that people wouldn't be talking about those things seems to me to be not really credible. And as I said before, I think history tells us that Secretaries of State use direction quite sparingly. They're conscious of the threshold. They need to consult on it. I don't regard that as any threat to the effective operation of the IRB.
The reason I ask is some of our witnesses have said that there is a concern that a future Secretary of State will not be able to resist the temptation to meddle, and therefore there should be, however it's drafted, that the interventions can only be at the strategic level.
Were this bill in law today, a future Secretary of State could never intervene as much as the current Secretary of State and Minister have to intervene now, because of the nature of the huge number of granular decisions they're given as a consequence of the department's direct involvement in specifying and running the train service. So I don't think in our heads this is something that we would worry about unduly. What we're trying to do is to argue out of the position we're in now, where the department does have such granular control of those things without being able to see the whole of the railway.
Thank you. Graham, you wanted to...
Thanks, Chair. There's a couple of points I'm quite interested in clarifying, and some of it's arising out of an earlier response you gave to the Chairman's questions at the very beginning. When you appeared at the Public Accounts Committee, Andrew, in April, I think it was, and you kind of repeated this today. You said the system cannot promise to deliver a return for the taxpayers' input because the system does not really function as a single system. You said it functions as a series of different actors at the moment. Well, the draft bill doesn't envisage anything other than an extension of the role of the private sector. So there'll be at least 30 odd companies operating trains, and there's going to be active encouragement for more open access operators. So I think it is possible to quantify the costs of fragmentation. I seem to recall it's about £1.5 billion a year. How can we be confident with all of these separate actors they will be speaking from the same script rather than their own? Can we be confident under this new draft bill that we'll have an end to fragmentation and all the actors playing their part from the one script?
Well, I think the bill does three things which very significantly improve the ability to manage the bits of the system which are best managed as a system. It does absolutely allow still for private freight operators and open access operators and for devolved administrations to specify. But the three very helpful things it does is it brings together the specification of the contracts for the vast majority of operators alongside infrastructure, so you don't get a misalignment of specification of infrastructure output and train operator output. It gives a requirement on the OOR to take into consideration the access use policy of this new body, which would be fundamentally designed to look at system optimization, and it requires a business plan to be published, which would set out what the aspirations of the integrated rail body were. Yes, of course, there will still be other actors, and so there will need to be coordination, and there will be some issues around that. But those three fundamental planks are things which are simply not there currently, and I think they add very significantly of the ability of the railway to deliver as a system.
In terms of what's on the face of the bill, there's no proposal to repeal the 1993 Act. So although I think there are 7 franchises that are being run by the operator of last resort by the government, that's a temporary arrangement, isn't it? Because there's a ban on the UK government permanently being an operator of rail franchises arising from that 73 Act. Mind you, 70% of our trains are operated in whole or part by foreign states. But should we be looking to repeal that 93 Act to give that flexibility? We heard from the Cabinet Secretary from Scotland earlier who raised concerns about this issue.
I mean, the decision to maintain private operators is a political decision, but what this bill does is allow the specification of infrastructure to be done alongside the specification of those contracts, and that is the thing which allows this to be a truly integrated rail body in a way that the Strategic Rail Authority, for example, wasn't previously.
Wouldn't preclude the repeal of that Act, assuming we had a change of government. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Can I just ask you to comment on the proposed role for the ORR in the new structure? Do you think it's the right proposal? And if not, how would you like it to be implemented?
Well, there's a lot that the bill would bring which would make the railway easier to run, and I think what I would say, and Andrew's got more experience of being a regulator, albeit in a slightly different environment. What I would say is that I'm hoping that the provision made in the bill and the use of secondary legislation would make suitable alterations to the ORR's role in order to make the railway easier to run. It is important. I mean, if you set the safety regulation aside, which is absolutely crucial, it is important that those entities on the railway, like open access and freight operators, do have a right and do have a right of appeal, because the IRB will be making some choices about how the railway is used. Andrew, do you want to say some more?
Yes, I think for us it's important that the powers to amend the access management regulations are included in the bill, because we've ended up with an odd situation whereby very, very detailed parts of regulation are now enshrined in in law in a way that was never intended in the original architecture. So things which were part of the OOR's policy, which the OOR could change, albeit in consultation with stakeholders, as a result of EU legislation in the first decade of this century, have become enshrined in secondary legislation, and that does create some anomalies. We can't change the date on which timetables are published. There are very, very prescriptive rules about what performance regimes need to do. There are delay attribution codes. I mean, there's a phenomenal level of detail which is now enshrined in secondary legislation, and that's why we think the powers in the bill to amend those are really crucial, because the issues are not so much about the fundamental duties of the OOR, which are amended, with the requirement to take into use the access use policy. They're with a system that has been set in stone because so much is now enshrined in legislation, albeit mostly secondary legislation. So we would be very, very supportive of retaining the provision in the bill around that ability to alter those regulations.
Indeed.
Or indeed to ultimately, dare I say, to take them out of secondary legislation. It's not about,
And for the avoidance of doubt for the long term, because if you go back to COVID again, it's quite hard to see what might happen in that if we're not going to get a railway reform bill every parliamentary session. So whatever's done here would have to last for a long time. So actually attempting to time limit the opportunity to change those, in our view, would be wrong.
Thank you. Jack.
Thank you, Chair. I just firstly wanted to ask you again about how we get this balance right, because we have seen an increasing trend of involvement of the department, and we haven't seen it go the other way. In terms of Mr. Morris mentioned about the number of operators who are now operators of last resort, we've not seen ever any go back the other way. So how do we ensure that actually we do see that trend and a move away from the department being so involved in the day-to-day running and more move towards the policy making that it should be focused on? How do we make sure that that actually happens? Because thus far we haven't seen the trend come back the other way. Maybe Andrew, you want to start first.
Well, we look at why the Williams Review, which was, if you like, the genesis of this draft bill was commissioned. It was because of three things. First of all, the May 18 timetable. But secondly, there'd been a failure of a further franchise, LNER, and the view was others were likely to fail. The third was there were just too few bidders for the contracts which were coming forward, and that, for me, is at the heart of this. If you want to create a vibrant private sector market for train operators, it needs to be contracts which are attractive, and they need to be risks that the private sector can reasonably bear. The reason people weren't bidding for those contracts is because the value of the risk they were being asked to take was a multiple of what they were when the contracts were first let, because the value of the revenue was that much greater. And so what was actually an acceptable risk in the 1990s wasn't an acceptable risk at the end of the end of the last decade, because the value of the risk was just too great. As part of the idea of having contracts which are attractive to the private sector, I do think is fundamental to this, and that then allows you to go back into competition. And a key piece of work as part of the overall rail reform programme is to develop those contracts. That's obviously been put into abeyance because of COVID and what that's done in terms of completely changing that. But I think what we hear from the private sector is they want contracts which are lower risk, but they need certainty of the architecture as well. And there was no point in letting contracts for train operators all the time. That this issue of, is there going to be GBR, is there going to be an integrated rail body, was left unanswered.
Well, Hendy, do you have confidence that the department is going to, let loose more and allow that dial to return to more of a stable position?
Well, I do, because I think if you stand back and look at this, if you're worried about the government interfering in the railway in the future, it's so closely engrossed in it now that actually the purpose of the bill is for the government to step back from the granular detail which is currently filling up the the Minister of State's box and also the Secretary of State. And I can't envisage any circumstances where, as a result of this bill, there would be more government attention to this detail. I think that
it's almost not possible.
It is almost not possible, as Andrew says. You know, the intention of this surely is to actually get government to say what it wants out of the money it pays for the entire British railway system. It wants the most it can for the least money, and to devolve the decisions to a body, and then that body to deal with them almost certainly regionally, because that would be the way to do it, which takes those decisions out of the government's purview and out of the department's systems.
I wanted to also ask about how we attract more private investment, because when it comes to particularly infrastructure, we haven't been as good maybe as other countries at attracting in that private investment to help pay for not just some of the operations, but also the infrastructure costs. And we know that obviously the amount of public money is ever decreasing. So what more, Andrew, do you think we could do, and why is it that we haven't been as good at attracting some of that infrastructure investment from the private sector?
Well, if you look at what infrastructure investors want, they want stable returns. Typically, the people who invest in infrastructure, they're not looking for very, very high yields, but they're looking for predictability. They typically tend to be pension funds, and we know there's a lot of money out there. So, having a long-term business plan, having a degree of separation from ministers actually help with that. We've actually got hoping to announce very, very soon now a very significant private sector intervention in the replacement of Network Rail's fibre network, so that because the ability of the private sector to utilise the spare capacity meets Treasury criteria, we think the new body needs to be incentivised to do that as part of its business planning processes, so that it isn't overly dependent upon public funds. We're very supportive of moves to create a joint development cooperation, which allows us to utilise land and harness a lot of the land. Network Rail is currently the second largest landowner in Britain, second only to the Crown. So we have very significant assets, and the ability to utilise those to bring in private sector contributions, we think, are very significant. So we think there are real opportunities, a stable platform to do that, strong incentives set by government as part of the business planning process will do that. And Peter could talk about how that's been done in TfL as well.
Sure, and a crucial part of the business plan, which is required from the IRB in this bill, is to talk about the sorts of investments that might be recommended to government to be made in the railway, because actually it's by listing them, it's by showing what could be done, that you can then go to people who would benefit from them. I'm sure we've discussed this before here. You go to people who might benefit from them and say it's more likely to happen if you put some money in. When I left TfL, most of the bigger items in the investment plan had some element of third-party funding in, from developers and other people who would have benefited or who would then benefit from the investment were it made. And I think one of the weaknesses of the current system is that everything's uncertain. Nothing can be certain enough for anybody to indicate they're really keen to put any money in until the day government announces it, and then everybody keeps their hands in their pockets, because why would you bother? Because government said it's going to pay for it, you know. And a pretty outstanding example of that is the Skyline in Birmingham, which is full of cranes waiting for HS2, but none of the people who've owned the land or who are developing it have put any money towards the scheme itself, which has been paid for by the taxpayer. Now, I wouldn't claim that, for example, the funding arrangements for Crossrail were perfect, and I think looking back on it, we could have extracted still more money out of people who are beneficiaries, but it did have significant elements of third-party funding in, and I think one of the anticipations that we should have of an IRB in this bill is that when it presents the sorts of things that government could invest to the Secretary of State, it's able to say how much can be got from third parties. It's not terribly difficult to do, actually, and we were discussing only yesterday with the Secretary of State and the Minister of State how we might achieve it, even in quite small schemes like Access for All schemes, where actually third parties do benefit from that, and it's not right that the railway and the taxpayer should pay for the whole of the benefit. And if we go out and try hard, as we've done in certain specific circumstances, we can get the odd £500,000 or £1 million from people to put into the scheme, and therefore the scheme should go up the list.
And you will know there are examples of opportunities of other parties to invest in Stoke, where we as Network Rail have a duty to protect we have a legal duty to protect our asset, and we can't take into consideration what might be wider benefit to the system as a whole. That creates perversities where we don't, as a system, then optimise, be that local authority funding, developer contribution, true private sector, third-party opportunities. This is why the integrated P&L is so important here. Absolutely. You do not, as opposed to an infrastructure body that's statutorily required to protect its assets, because it doesn't benefit from a growing railway system.
And in terms of, we've talked also about those access and management regulations. There are concerns that some of those changes may favour some operators over others, particularly around the vertical integration of track and train. How are we going to make sure that some operators and users of the railway are not disadvantaged by some of those changes?
Well, we still have an independent regulator that's got very, very clear duties. Secondly, it's very clear that the licence will continue and there will be licence obligations on the entity. And then thirdly, any such changes to the access management regulations will be subject to very significant consultation as is required. And I think all of those three things give real protection from any misuse of that opportunity. But it is really important that as a system we're able to be more responsive. We are really anomalous in having so many of our normal methods of working, our abilities to flex, respond to demand, being constrained by legislation. I don't think there's another entity in the British system that is so constrained in that regard, and that doesn't work in the interests of the users.
Well, Hendy, do you think these changes will facilitate more competition, more choice for passengers by attracting in those alternative operators onto the network?
So I'm pleased that you mentioned passengers, because actually in the previous question you were talking about favouring one operator against another. I think the primary intention of the railway is to create connectivity for passengers and freight, and the integrated rail body must make its decisions in the light of the best benefit to passengers. Is that likely to encourage competition? Yeah, it is likely to encourage the right sort of competition, providing that's the government's intention. There's no reason why not. But actually the decisions it makes and the appeals which are made against it, you would want to be made on the basis of primarily of passenger benefit or freight benefit, because that's the point of the railway. It's the point of the operators. Sure, they've got contracts and commercial interests or public interest if they're owned by the government, but the overall intention of the railway is what we're talking about here, and that's what the IRB should be concentrating on.
Gavin, turn to you.
Thanks very much. I'm conscious of time, so we'll try and move this along if we can. But with regard to the business plan, what is your understanding of the conditions that will be placed around the requirement for the IRB to produce said business plan?
I think the bill itself it doesn't give specific provisions.
Hence the question.
Yeah. But it fits in. Look, it fits into a broader context. So there is a lot of requirement still in the in the Railways Act. If we think, for example, in the context of having listened to the Cabinet Secretary in the Scottish Government talking earlier, there's a very, very detailed HLOS statement which is issued by the Scottish Government as part of that. The idea that the business plan wouldn't have to incorporate that seems to me to be not credible, because there'd still be separate legislation. You wouldn't want two parallel issues.
I mean, it must be that it has to be interpreted, and I think it's very helpful that it's generalised. I mean, every investment in the railway lasts longer than one parliamentary term. Most of the money we spend lasts 50 to 60 to 100 years. So you would want to see a long-term plan, and the budget and business plan on a short-term basis being an interpretation of that meets the bottom line from the railway and P&L terms, which is demanded by government. And I don't think it's difficult in my head, and I don't think Andrew sees it difficult in his head to interpret how that might look.
You're relying on your own interpretation. People can interpret things in different ways potentially. Do you think more should be on the face of the bill to make it easier to interpret, if you want to put it that way?
I mean, for me, it's so obvious that I don't think it needs to be said. I think the level of detail is what would have to be produced in order to answer to the Secretary of State and indeed to Parliament about what the railway was doing. It would be absurd if it was so high level that you couldn't see what individual investments were going to deliver. And in fact, it would be good for individual investments to have more transparency than they currently do, frankly.
You referenced to kind of a parliamentary term, I think, is how you put it. It's obviously your point is it's a 5-year business plan, but given the timescales as you've alluded to in terms of the railway and control periods, but why not a 10-15 year business plan as opposed to a 5-year plan? What's the point of a 5-year plan?
If that's what I said, then I didn't mean to say it.
That's what I'm saying. But I'm interpreting what you said.
I think it's inevitable that it has to be a much longer-term plan, of which there is a near-term element, which is very clear about what the railway will do in the next year and the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years. You have to plan those big investments long in advance, because quite simply it's evident, it's not a failure, it's evident that if you invest in some of the things that we're talking about, we've got a big scheme to invest in digital signalling for the 21st century. That will inevitably go on probably beyond my lifetime.
I mean, the Department for Transport has asked us to develop a long-term strategic plan, and that is a very much 20-30-year plan, but I think it's not. I would love to say there was a cheque from the Treasury for 10 or 15 years, but I think it's not credible to think that you're going to get for your operating expenditure that you're going to get that level of certainty. And indeed, when the railways experimented with very long franchises, in practice they've ended up with break clauses because it doesn't suit anyone to be tied to a funding stream for 10 or 15 years, which then can't accommodate shocks or changes.
Yeah, let me put it this way then. You said a longer term plan, but with a short term element. Or
yes.
I don't want to put words in your mouth. Would you prefer a long term plan, a long term business plan that's updated every 5 years? And in answering that, how does that? Because you brought up yourself, Andrew, in terms of the long term strategy. How does that business plan relate to the long term strategy for rail?
I think you could play that either way. I think you make a very valid point that understanding the interplay between a long-term strategic plan and the 5-year cycles of funding is something to be worked through. I'm not a legislative expert. Whether or not that's appropriate on the face of the bill or not, I don't know. But it feels to me like a level of detail probably isn't necessary on the bill, but I can absolutely see that mechanism is necessary and is going to be really important, because unless the significance of that long-term funding is that railways take a long time. If you want to do significant infrastructure interventions, Transparent Route Upgrade has been 10 years in the preparation. We're really getting under the skin of it now. It's another 10 years before it's really complete. That's a 20-year programme. So having visibility of that and understanding that you're funded for the costs and accountable for delivering the revenue benefits is really important.
And I think we can demonstrate that actually the 5-year operations maintenance and renewal funding of Network Rail has produced circumstances where actually the money is more wisely spent and more efficient to spend, and also gives, very importantly, the supply industry some confidence in employing and training people and investing. In my life at Transport for London, the amount of our capital plan that was funded by the government varied according to the circumstances, and following the financial crisis of 2008 it reduced quite dramatically. I don't think the railway can expect to be immune from those shocks, but we can make the case for long-term investment. Equally, the government will want to see some short-term budgeting simply because it's got other things to spend its money on as well. So we wouldn't expect a total commitment for long-term operational funding. It wouldn't be realistic.
And when might we see the long-term strategy for rail?
I suspect realistically now that's probably going to be after the next election. Yep.
What you might say that to be fair. A couple of quick supplementaries, if I may. How does, and obviously as part of the transition team, how does the IRB or GBR, whatever you want to call it, see its future relationship with trade unions and staff working out? Might we see in the end a potential return to national bargaining, or do you still envisage that as being completely down to each specific operator?
Like all the time we've got private companies, my understanding of employment law is that they will be the employer, and therefore that wouldn't constitute national bargaining. Absolutely, there is a need for a strategic relationship with all the partners in the system, and the workforce are, critical partners in that. And I spoke at the PAC hearing about the fact that I was very pleased that ultimately we were able to do a deal with the RMT that delivered real productivity, because we could demonstrate to everybody it was in the long-term interests of the railway and the people who work within Network Rail.
And one of the points of friction when it comes to rail reform, because obviously Labour have launched a plan for rail, and Scottish Government have their position, etc. One thing that's not addressed in is the role of Roscoe's, which many still think is an issue within the system in terms of it's the money that goes out of the system and goes elsewhere. So under the draft bill as it stands, and as you understand it, would in the end, if incoming government so chose to decide to directly procure rather than use Roscoe's, does the bill give the IRB power to do so? Sorry, does the draft bill give IRB the power to do so?
I don't believe that statutory powers are needed for that. I mean, certainly the government in England and indeed in Scotland have done some direct procurements historically. So my understanding is that you don't require additional powers to do that currently.
So that's my understanding as well, but just seeking clarity for the record. But in terms of Luxembourg Protocol, etc., once this was ratified, if anybody chose to or wanted to join Eurofima, for instance, would that be okay? Would that require further legislation?
I'm not an expert on those provisions.
Probably answer your question for you. I thought I'd get
neither am I.
And very, very quick last question for me. You've obviously heard the evidence this morning from Cabinet Secretary Hyslop. You may have seen the evidence yesterday as well. Do you understand, and obviously you're well aware of the relationships, infrastructure relationships that exist in Scotland at the moment with the ScotRail Alliance, but obviously not been devolved to Scotland. Do you accept that there is a worry at the Scottish and Welsh Government level that this new IRB moves that accountability further away from the devolved administrations?
I'm not sure that we would say it necessarily does. I carry the framework agreement between the Department of Transport and Network Rail constantly now, because it has some references to my obligations to the Cabinet Secretary in Scotland, and indeed she's very punctilious in making sure that I attend to them, and I think that that's absolutely right. We're an important part of the railway in Scotland, they of course have absolutely the right to make representations on the railway that they would like to have, but I think our practical view is that actually we can make it work in Scotland, and we have, and we can make it work in Wales, and we have. And one of the important things about those relationships is that we treat those people as indeed we should treat the combined authority mayors as partners, and not some sort of secondary stakeholders.
I appreciate, but would you accept that in copying the Scottish, well, in largely trying to copy the Scottish model and providing for a full integration of track and train in England, that this essentially sets in, by not devolving to Scotland, then Scotland can never fully integrate track and train? So in actually copying Scotland, you're now hamstringing Scotland's ability to fully integrate track and train. Is that not a fair assessment of the situation?
Look, I don't believe it's the intention of the bill to make that any harder. I think, as I said, we have a very, very detailed set of requirements from the Scottish Government as part of the HLOS, and that part of the legislation isn't changed. And there's a lot further we can go in Scotland than we currently are in integrating. So
Yes.
I don't believe it's the intention of the legislation to that, but no doubt there will be discussions with ministers, in Westminster and Holyrood, around the bill's intentions there. But I've not heard any sense of that, and I think there's a lot of further upside for Scottish Government in terms of how we can run the railways well.
Those questions are probably more relevant to folks sitting behind you in the next panel. So thanks, Chair.
Thank you. I'd just like to ask one final area, and that's on GBR having a centralised ticketing platform. That was initially mooted for GBR, and then the government decided that it was no longer required, and the private operators and both the train operators and private companies could easily provide that. We've also heard evidence that actually from private operators that having that central platform would be desirable and open it up to new entrants. Do you have a view on that, whether GBR should provide this central platform?
I think what we see at the moment is there are some very, very strong private sector players in the form of Trainline, and if you look at the products of a number of the train operators, they've not been invested in in the same level, and therefore I think there isn't as much consumer choice as we would like to see. And I think not least because I think ease of retailing is one of the ways that we grow the rail network. Whether or not you do that through a single centralised system or enhanced retailing outputs from the individual operators, I think is something we can live with one way or the other. But absolutely, I think what we need to do is create a healthy, competitive market because I think customers are best served by good, strong competition.
I think the related issue, if I may, is about the transparency of the whole process of information and ticketing, and that is something that Keith Williams concentrated on very strongly, and it's clearly a subject on which many users of the railway have quite a lot of criticism at the moment. And actually, I think one of the real advantages of an integrated rail body is to get to grips with the myriad of the impossibly complex fare structure, which is a different issue from the retailing of tickets, but which is tied up with it, because actually what we all want is the railway to generate more revenue, cost the taxpayer less and deliver more, and actually a body that was better able to rationalise the fare structure and make it more understandable will generate more revenue, and that's crucial to us. We would not want, if we were there, to consume any more public money than we needed to. And one of the best ways of doing it is to generate revenue from a system that's easy to use and transparent to its customers. It's as important as reducing the cost.
Thank you. I'd love to continue the discussion, but we do have our final panel to move on to. Just before I conclude, is there anything else you would like to put on the record that we haven't covered this morning or indeed in your written evidence?
Only to emphasise our personal commitments to railway reform, irrespective of how it affects us personally. It is the right thing to do. Bringing forward this bill is a significant step forward, and we would like nothing more than to see legislation which enabled a more coherent structure for the railway to reduce its cost and to increase its revenue.
Just to reinforce Peter's point, it must be quite rare for a select committee to have a chair and chief executive advocating their own demise. But absolutely, we believe that Network Rail, has outlived its useful purpose, and actually an integrated rail body is a much better approach.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. I'm very grateful for your time and evidence this morning. Thank you. Order.
Thank you.
The proceeding is currently suspended. 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 The proceeding is currently suspended.
Order, and welcome to our final panel in our pre-legislative scrutiny of the draft Rail Reform Bill. Before we get into questions, Minister, could I ask you to introduce yourself and your team for the record, please?
Yes, good morning, Chair, to you and the committee. I'm Hugh Merriman, I'm the Rail Minister. I'll leave Conrad and Alex to introduce themselves.
So, Conrad Bailey, the Director General for Public Transport and Local within the Department for Transport.
Good morning, Alex Hynes. I'm the Director General of Rail Services at the Department for Transport.
Thank you, and we're very grateful to all of you for your time this morning. If I could, before we get into the sort of detailed questions about the bill, we are doing pre-legislative scrutiny. How open is the government to changing the content of the bill from its current draft form?
And the first thing is to thank you and the committee for the work that you've done today in such a sort of short period of time as well. We're really grateful. We were really keen that it was you that was given this area of responsibility because of your interest and expertise. And so we wanted to place on the record our thanks. And of course, we're completely open to the views and the recommendations that you may wish to put forward. I've heard a number of them already. We'll give that the consideration you would expect. Even more so because it sets the sort of framework in the future for how rail will operate under this new set of reforms. So we're certainly open to any recommendations that you may wish to pass through to us.
Thank you. And if you could set out the government's broad timetable for how we move forward. This committee will produce our recommendations as swiftly as possible. And certainly hope to do so this side of summer recess. Once we do that, what are the government's next steps? When can we hopefully see full legislation introduced?
To a certain extent, it depends what you recommend and actually what we're able to, what we then go back to you on, because there would usually be a 2-month period for us to respond to your recommendations and to either accept or with reason, reject, or indeed there may be somewhere in between the two. In the event that you made recommendations which we actually felt would improve the bill, then we would have to go through a process of agreement through government ourselves, which can sometimes take a little longer than those 2 months. So I'm not seeking to avoid the issue. I mean, if you made no recommendations to us to alter anything at all, then we would certainly get back to you within the 2 months. And then from our perspective, we would then view this as having sort of received the parliamentary scrutiny, which we always said should allow it to speed through with legislation, which would then allow us to bid at the earliest opportunity for a legislative slot.
Realistically, you've previously said that you would like to see full legislation introduced before the election. Given that we are now within 6 months or so of that election, is there a realistic chance that could happen?
It's incredibly challenging to see that occurring, and every day when that bell rings for the adjournment much earlier than we would normally expect, I always think of this legislation. So that shows the desire I have to put it down as early as we possibly can. I know it's very optimistic, but I still work on the basis that if this is shown to have the support from this committee and then sort of feeding in through, as I know, the House of Lords have, then the cross-party sort of nod that we have right now in terms of Labour's own plan for rail, which is not that far away from what we're putting forward in terms of the IRB, then I would like to hope that it could actually start its journey, but I'm aware of how near to an election we are, so a dose of realism is probably required.
Thank you. Fabian.
Thank you, Chair. Minister, may I start off by just asking you about this draft bill which would give the Secretary of State the power to issue directions to the IRB. Why is this necessary?
Yes, and actually, what I should also just say from the outset is, because again, I think it rather neatly just demonstrates how we as a department are seeking to move. We wouldn't be making these changes if we didn't want to pass operational day-to-day responsibility over to GBR. We don't seek to sort of control, we actually seek to pass that over. So Conrad will end up, well, is running the team which is going to look more on the strategic side of the railway, which is where the Secretary of State would be looking at. Alex has come in with his experience from Scotland and has already merged two existing government departments, track and train effectively, in order to be what you described as the lift and shift part, which would come out of the department and over to GBR. So we are already creating the internal structures that allow the Secretary of State to continue his role within the IRB, but more importantly to allow the day-to-day operational functions, which currently too much of it sits with the department, to be moved over to GBR, and that's very much Alex's job, and they'll both be able to talk to this as well, and I would invite you to ask them. In terms of the Secretary of State's responsibility, the Secretary of State will be the sole shareholder for GBR. The Secretary of State will be able to sort of set the 5-year strategy in terms of the funding and then the sort of high-level specification, which is exactly what happens with the 5-year control period for Network Rail. And the Secretary of State will ultimately be responsible and accountable to Parliament for the operation in terms of the overall railway piece. I don't think any MPs are going to sort of pull back and say, OK, well, Secretary of State, you're not responsible. We'll wait for the accounting officer from GBR to come before us. That will still be there, and I believe will still be required. And Mr Hamilton, I'll give you one example. If you look at what happened under the 1993 Railways Act and rail track, it was a good example of where actually things were, if you like, set free away from government, and I don't believe it worked. A change was actually made. Rail track was then effectively brought back in terms of Network Rail. That 5-year sort of review period and funding was then put in place with that accountability for the Secretary of State. And I believe the railways are in a much better place as a result of that. They're certainly a lot safer. So I do think there is a role still for the Secretary of State. But let me be clear, operational day-to-day will be for GBR. The Secretary of State will still have a role to play in terms of the accountability that Parliament expects the Secretary of State to be responsible for with regards to the railway. I agree, it's where you actually put the mark in the middle that is the bit
you
that's
believe
important.
Sorry, I'll just add before Mr Bailey comes in. You believe that it will be quite clear who's accountable for what, Mr Bailey?
So I was just going to expand slightly on how we see the direction and guidance working. So we would expect the Secretary of State, or indeed potentially GBR, if it believed it required direction, to consult with GBR, the ORR, other interested parties who may be relevant, for example, the devolved administrations, before a direction or guidance was issued. At the point it is issued, in order to ensure there's real transparency there, and you can see that sort of flow through from the licence and the business plan that I know Lord Hendy and Andrew Haines were talking to you about. We would expect that to then be published, so again there's real transparency around how it works. In sort of designing this power, we've looked carefully at other bodies where typically those bodies that you want to be remote from government do ensure that the Secretary of State has that power, particularly when they are of sort of national interest and also an area where there's significant taxpayer funding.
Can you give us an example of the circumstances in which you would envisage using the power of direction?
I'd give an example being the timetable change potentially. So again, if you look at matters at the moment with regards to change of the timetable, it can only take place on the second Saturday in December, and that causes a lot of issues because as you run up to Christmas is not the ideal time to be changing a timetable. So we talking yesterday with Andrew and Peter about the timetable process. Now that would actually require some form of amendment through the sort of 100 pages of railway legislation that's there. And I think if the Secretary of State didn't have the sort of secondary legislative powers that we're envisaging, then we'd have to wait for a primary legislative slot, which is hard to get for the reasons we touched on right at the start of this, in order just to actually change the way we can operate a timetable review. And so in order to be nimble and be able to keep the sort of record book, if you like, in terms of legislation up to date in a speedy and efficient manner, and that timetable change is one that we're looking at right now, then I believe these powers, with the countervailing checks and balances that Conrad mentioned, because there will be the consultation requirement, there will also be a requirement for an affirmative process through Parliament, then I believe that gives the right sort of power to be able to move the railway on, giving the powers to GBR to be able to look towards the future and change, but at the same time have enough checks and balances and accountability within the parliamentary process.
We've heard during these hearings that some concern, I think, about the unfettered nature of the power to direct runs the risk of creating uncertainty amongst stakeholders, including potential investors, of course. How would you seek to reassure them?
I do appreciate it's getting that balance right. And also, I appreciate that whilst I can say it's our intention, as demonstrated by the way that the department has restructured itself and the fact that we're putting this change through for rail reform, so that we take the operational running of the railway outside of the department, that governments can change, and therefore it's the powers one looks at rather than the actual prevailing desire and culture. So I do appreciate that. I mean, I hope both Conrad and I have listed examples of where we would see those changes made either by the regulation or by the guidance. And I heard the points that Fiona Hyslop made before, that we would seek to consult with the devolved authorities where it would have a material impact on their own powers, and all those other sets of checks and balances. But obviously, if the committee feels that it wants to recommend further in that space in terms of ideas, we would look at those.
Thank you. No, that's very helpful. Minister, the Secretary of State's power to modify the IRB's licence, as you know, is a broad one. But we've heard that it has the potential, as I said earlier, to create some uncertainty amongst stakeholders. Now, what are the circumstances in which you would anticipate modifying the licence, do you think?
Of course, the licence requirement is set down in the legislation. The actual licence content is actually a sort of developing body. That itself, once it's out there, will be put towards consultation. So that's not a sort of current document that is actually going to come on as an annex to the rail reform legislation. It just enables it to start its process. So the consultation process for the licence will be sort of full and open in that regard. And of course, there will then be a whole series of checks from the ORR, who will have a certain sort of specified, sort of defined areas that it will actually govern. So freight, environment, accessibility, for example. So we're actually trying to increase its scope as far as that's concerned. Conrad, Alex, if you want to come in on that.
So we would expect the draft licence, as the Minister says, to be properly consulted on. We'd expect it then to be, in all likelihood, reviewed on probably a 5-yearly basis, linked to the business planning cycle. So again, their adjustments could be made where necessary, again subject to consultation. When and if there was requirements for changes to the licence between that period, perhaps because the ORR needed to make some adjustments, something had actually changed, so it was no longer deliverable, or like. Again, we'd expect a similar process.
I mean, when would we be likely to see a draft licence, do you think?
So we're not in a position to publish a draft licence and consult on it yet. Typically, for other bodies where these similar licences have been produced, it's once it's clear what the views of the House are on the legislation that you can then consult on the licence, because if, for example, there were amendments to the legislation, we may need to reflect those in it. We would then, once that's clear, we would expect that consultation to take place so that it came into force at the point when the new body was set up. So there is kind of a sequence that we need to follow, including having clarity on what the legislation is in terms of consulting effectively on the licence.
Would this committee be able to scrutinise that draft licence before it became an actual licence, do you think?
I would certainly expect that to be the case, and would welcome it as well. I mean, it's a bit chicken egg, because obviously the legislation itself actually starts the process of the licence and sort of puts it into legislation. Then the content of the licence, separate agreement, which, as Conrad says, opens to the consultation. We would very much expect and welcome this committee, and indeed even beforehand, so with your recommendations, if there was anything you felt we should be thinking about in terms of the content of the licence, then we're very happy to do so. And again, the reassurance is that if there are additional powers that GBR ends up moving into, then it will need fresh licence conditions in order to do that, because that's a requirement of running the railways.
My final question, Chair, can I just ask, again, how would you reassure those who've got concerns about the interference by the Secretary of State in the running of the IRB?
A number of ways, Pat. Firstly, there is an awful lot of interference right now from the Department for Transport in terms of the operational day-to-day running of the railway. That will change. That's why this legislation is before you. That's why GBR is being set up to take away the operational day-to-day from the Department for Transport. Then there is a question of, but there are still the ability for directions and guidance. I would say that is a required way to ensure that the legislative record book is kept up to date, but in a speedy manner that allows GBR, if it approaches the department and wants to change, so for example, the timetable idea I gave you, that can be done. And then in terms of, well, actually, what about all the other checks and balances that are needed in case someone decides to meddle and interfere and do things differently to how our culture is being set, then there is that requirement to consult. There is the requirement to engage with those bodies who may believe they have powers that are there as well. And then you've got the ORR overreaching sort of regulation and guidance as well. But I do believe there is a right role. Any government that's elected, their Secretary of State for Transport should have the ability to take account and be responsible for the railways, which means they also have to have certain powers if they're going to be held to account.
I think our previous witnesses agreed with that, so thank you very much, Minister. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. But just a supplementary on that, we've heard some evidence and argument that, yes, people accept that ultimately Secretary of State should have the right to intervene, but there should be on the face of the bill some framework that sets out the circumstances, so it is a strategic intervention rather than a day-to-day operational one. Do you think there's some merit in that argument?
Well, given that we believe that the day-to-day operational responsibility should be outside of the Secretary of State and the Department, then logically I would agree with that. And I can understand the aim of your work is to actually look beyond different governments and different cultures and ensure that powers can't be used in a manner which wouldn't be appropriate. So I understand the ethos, because if I were to say I didn't, then it would seem to suggest we're not really serious about giving up day-to-day operational responsibility. So again, I'm happy to read your recommendation in this bit.
I'll say we haven't decided as a committee if that's what we'll recommend, but it's certainly an argument that's been put to us by several witnesses. If I could turn, we've talked about the licence, I'd like just to turn to the business plan, which the IRB will be required to publish. The bill doesn't contain any timeframes or conditions about consultation, and it can change the business plan as it wishes. Is that the right approach, or should there be some, on the face of the bill, some conditions about the adoption of a business plan?
I mean, I equate it, as I did earlier on, to the sort of process where we've got a 5-year control period for Network Rail, and again, having that 5-year sort of plan in place. So again, the plan is initially determined as to how the high-level output specification and statement of funds availability will be operating, and then that plan is then put forward in that regard. And I think it actually works rather well with regards to the control period. I think the thing that I'd be keen to ensure is we don't have a sort of lag as one 5-year period ends, another one starts. We've all heard about those before, not least in this committee. So I believe that it works to that regard. It takes into account then the spending periods that we have, which are obviously outside of those windows as well. And then we've also got the annual report on the private sector to look at things on an annual basis. But I'd expect it to be an iterative basis. By drawing all of track and train and operations together, I would expect that, A, you've got the ability to be able to plan ahead for 5 years because you are bringing passenger services into that sphere as well. So there's a lot more that you can set out in advance. So I'm comfortable with it as it stands, but I'm, again, happy to take any views to the contrary that this committee may have.
I mean,
Did you want to come out?
Network Rail currently undertakes a business planning process every 5 years in a highly consultative, transparent way, and I'm sure Great British Railways will do exactly the same. The key win, of course, here is that the fact it will be an integrated business plan covering track and train, which is a huge step forward to creating a more coherent railway across Britain.
And it will be assured by the ORR as you see in the current control period process.
Thank you. And on the IRB's power to award franchises, it, and I quote, must have regard to a statement of policy from the Secretary of State while exercising that power. What happens if the IRB rejects what the Secretary of State has suggested?
I haven't actually sort of considered that particular part. I mean, we envisage obviously not least the next wave of the new passenger service contracts, where we would try and bring some competition back in terms of the awarding of contracts. So we're working on the basis that there'll be the proper sort of tender process, which can take time to be able to put together, and then those contracts will be put to the market. That would be at the private sector, as would be envisaged here, and then the bidder that succeeds will be selected by GBR. I wouldn't assess the Secretary of State being involved in that part, not least the contracting powers under this legislation have been transferred away from the Secretary of State. So there's no attempt to try and sort of backdoor and intervene. Conrad, Alex, did you want to?
Well, I mean, obviously it might depend whether it's directions or guidance, because the impact would be different. And the network licence for Great British Railways, which will be regulated by ORR and granted by the Secretary of State, will set some of these things out.
There won't be the staff, because Alex will have lifted the staff out to actually provide. At the moment, as you know, per train operator, there's an awful lot of staff within DFT to actually help with that business planning process and the decision making. That will all be transferred over to Great British Railways. So there won't actually be the means, if you like, and the expertise to be able to sort of to check the homework, as it were.
Thank you, Chair. And I think you heard earlier with the previous panel, we were talking about the private involvement and trying to encourage more private investment into both the operation and the infrastructure of the railway. And obviously there is a duty for the IRB to report annually about increasing involvement of the private sector. What was the sort of intention behind this, and do you think this will be effective at getting more of that private investment into the railways?
Yes, and I know that, and I listened to your questioning from previously, Mr. Barrett, and I've been through it before as well over the years, and I think it's something that Andrew and Peter always answer with great reassurance. But I know there is this concern that this is a sort of network rail sort of state takeover, when in fact it's designed to be the complete opposite. It's designed to help Network Rail have a more commercial culture and to ultimately integrate track and train to make it more efficient for the passenger. But we do recognise that there is a sort of concern as to the crowding out of the private sector. So that is an example of where we're sort of seeking to put our culture into the content of the legislation, having an annual review where there's a requirement for GBR as sort of reviewed and regulated by the ORR to be able to demonstrate how it's allowed the private sector to grow, and then it sort of shifts, it sort of puts that culture on the side of the tin in terms of there being a requirement not just to work with the private sector but to grow it as well. And I'll give you the example of, as I mentioned before, the new passenger service contracts. That is where I'd ideally love to see contracts that can go out to the market, because rail operators can grow passenger services, make money from it themselves, but ultimately that's great for the taxpayer, because we'll get a greater return, the passengers get a greater timetable, and we've got that element of competition that we've currently lost. That's sort of exactly why we've put all of the passenger service part into GBR, so it can do that.
We heard from Lord Hendy about the need perhaps for more longer term plans, as well as obviously the 5-year business plan, the need for maybe more longer term plans to encourage in some of that private investment into infrastructure as well. Is there the scope to allow sort of longer term plans to be developed so that it will actually attracting more of that private investment?
Yes, but again, I remember having this discussion sort of early into my tenure where we were talking about sort of 30-year strategy, and I'm also conscious of the credibility. If we haven't delivered rail reform and the integrated rail body and put together track and train and given that platform, people might think it's a bit odd to be talking about an even longer term strategy when you haven't even built the foundations. So I was really keen that we did what we're doing and discussing here, delivered rail reform, delivered the integrated rail body. We have the 5-year period in place, which is like the control period. And then I think there's the credibility and the foundations for GBR to then lead an even longer term strategy in place. And we know that business likes certainty. So I believe that by making these changes, we're more likely to see A, the ability for a credible longer term plan, and B, a lot more investment because business has got that certainty.
And also I wanted to ask you about the AOR's responsibility to promote competition, and this is something that's been added in, obviously, which to further develop that responsibility of the AOR. Do you think that this will actually help to attract more competition and attract more involvement and choice on our railway?
Yes, I certainly hope so. And if you look at the role that the ORR has to play already with regards to open access applications, of which there have been a plethora over just in the last week, then I think it's probably fair to say, and again it was a conversation we're having with Andrew and Peter yesterday, that we need perhaps to change the process, because what's important is you can't just, if you've got a number of applications, for example, coming in on the same line, you can't look at the first one that comes in. You have to look holistically at all of those options. So it needs a bit of a refresh. I mean, it's a positive thing because we're now starting to see more interest in the running of the railways, which again I hope will lend itself towards the sort of train operator contracts also having that same element of competition in. But I think that the more ORR can actually go into this space and act in a really positive, dynamic manner to promote competition and to enable competition through its own processes, as well as GBR's processes, then that can only lead to a better outcome.
Do you think the AOR will be effective at doing this? Because obviously it's a much more complex task for them to achieve, and I think they've admitted that themselves, that that it's a much more complex change for them to achieve. So do you think they will be effective at encouraging more of that competition and choice for not just for passengers but for freight as well?
Well, I believe so, because before I took this role up, I remember having conversations with the ORR, and they were always keen to sort of get involved in sort of helping make better decisions. So as well as being the check and balance, how can they actually lend their expertise, without sort of demarking the correct check and balance lines, to enable better decisions to be made. And if you look at open access applications where they ultimately do make the decision, there's a lot of work that has to go on between them and Network Rail, which would become GBR, in terms of making that decision. So I think there's a lot more that can be done. And that's no criticism of the ORR as they are now, but I think this framework gives a really good opportunity for them to actually look at the role that they play, not least because whilst at the moment they don't obviously regulate passenger service contract awards, and that wouldn't be the case, but the 5-year plan involves passenger contracts performance, if you like, and of course they're responsible for regulating the 5-year plan. So they are going to start to sort of enter into that space. So I think it's an opportunity for them to sort of look with positivity and optimism about what they can do to make the railway better. And I think they're a great organisation that have served us well and can improve.
It's worth probably saying we've been doing quite a lot of work with both the ORR, just as we have with Network Rail, with GBR TT, with Transport Focus, the other rail bodies. Just like DFT needs to fundamentally change, and we've begun that journey ourselves. The ORR certainly recognises that it will need to change, and it will need slightly different capabilities and capacities, I think particularly in the sort of areas that the Minister was just talking about, and they're very alive to that, and we've been talking to them about how we will make sure that happens with them and support them on that journey.
Graham, you wanted to come in at this point.
Thanks, Chair. I'd like to come back to the point that the Minister raised about passenger service contracts with Conrad Bailey a little later, but I just want to pick up on this one point about the franchises. And just to remind the Minister about evidence that he gave on a previous occasion to the committee, when we were talking about the advantages or otherwise of privately run franchises as opposed to the directly operated services. We know there are 7 franchises in the public sector, 3 in the devolved nations, 4 in England, and I think 3 of them are in my region. And the last time you appeared before the committee, Minister, you said you were not focused or dogmatic about one particular system or the other, private or public. And you said, I am, however, focused on the performance and the turnaround. And you said, I went on to say, it's interesting to know that the performance across their stable, that's the directly operated services, every single one of the 4 operators has gone up if you look at June and July's performance. And yet, within the terms of the draft bill that we're scrutinising, there's no provision for a permanent public sector operator. In fact, it's specifically excluded under the terms of the 1993 Act. On reflection, do you think that is an omission or something that we should be addressing?
So, firstly, I'm very supportive. We'll always support and stand up for all of the train operators, regardless of whether they're open access, sort of private TOC, or within the operator of last resort, because all their staff and their management work hard to give a better return for the passenger. So I'm happy with those words, Mr. Morris, because that's what I hope I would actually say about all of the passenger operators. Our plan is for the new passenger service contracts to be developed and then put out to the market by the IRB. And they would be put out to the private sector to bid, and the best bid for the taxpayer and the passenger, one would expect to see take those contracts on and have enough longevity to be able to invest in those services as well. So that's the model we have. It's not a model that says once the contracts have come to an end, then they can be sort of directly awarded to a nationalised operator. That's just not the way we foresee the railway running in the best manner.
Well, that's interesting. Now, I appreciate your candour, but I mean the reality is the way the system is set up, the way the legislation, the draft legislation is drafted, it places a duty on GBR to report on what it's doing to promote the private sector's role in rail. So even the most successful directly operated services, it's only a temporary arrangement, isn't it? So GBR will be under political instructions then to privatise them or to offer the contracts at an early opportunity. I wonder if we're not being dogmatic, and this is about improving the experience for passengers and getting a good service and value for money for the public. Why is it that we exclude the British state from running services, franchises, when 70% of those currently operated are owned wholly or partially by foreign states? Is that not discriminatory?
Well, I don't seek to discriminate against countries around the world, so by its very definition, that's not discriminatory. I mean, let me just put it in its sort of more base.
Against us?
I don't have any issue with international trade coming to this country and actually creating jobs. If you look at the train manufacturers, the 3 that we've brought into this country, one very near you, one from Japan, one from Spain, and one in Siemens from sort of Germany, Austria. Welcome our international friends to this country to create jobs and GDP for the country. I'm completely open about that, and I want to see even more of it. But coming back to your point, the aim for us is to integrate track and train. And so I'll give you a good example where it works really well, because you look at the passenger performance, it's at its highest in the Anglia region, so East Anglia. You've got 2 train operators there, Greater Anglia C2C. You've got the Network Rail team, who both have fantastic records. And that's a good example of where the private and the public sector working together closely are delivering a better return for the passenger. And that's exactly what integration is all about. So no, I don't want more state, because actually I'm trying to move it away from the state and actually have the operational day-to-day running of the railway integrated together, run by the railway rather than by politicians. Because I don't believe that politicians are the best entity to be able to run the railway. So everything I'm doing is actually trying to put it in the hands of the experts, bring in the private sector to be able to grow the railway in a similar manner to how we saw in the 20 years prior to the pandemic, where passenger numbers doubled when we had private sector competition involved.
I'm afraid philosophically, Minister, we'll have to.
I thought we wouldn't agree on that one. It's fair to say. But we'll always be friends.
We're like water, and we're discussing the draft bill on rail reform here. I'm afraid private isn't best, and the customer experience may suggest otherwise. I will agree that the best railway in the world, Switzerland, it's the cheapest, the most efficient, and it's completely in public ownership.
Yeah, but as I say, the best performing train operators, the top 3 are private.
Can I just ask one point of clarification? Yeah. It's a very short one, because we had some evidence from the Cabinet Secretary from Scotland who raised a number of quite valid issues, I thought, about consent and so on. But just for my understanding, is the Scottish Government classed as a foreign government? In other words, yes. Under the terms of the 93
Now you're talking.
Are the Scottish Parliament, are the Scottish Government allowed to permanently run a rail franchise?
They're not as foreign as I think Gavin, Mr. Newlands would like them to be.
Well, I'd like legislation,
I could think of no better person to bring in at this point than Alex. Who,
we're not going into constitutional arguments here.
I just wonder the definition of the 93 Act. Are they allowed?
It's my understanding that the Scottish Government's powers were amended by a more recent act, whereby they're allowed to propose a public sector bidder, and that applies in Scotland.
Will those powers be overridden by the IRB under the terms?
No. So obviously, the Scottish Government already has significant powers over rail in Scotland, both on infrastructure and on train operation, and those powers are protected and preserved by this draft bill.
But the Scottish Government can actually effectively devolve back into the integrated rail body to actually do the type of tendering of contracts, passenger contracts I just described to you, should the Scottish Government wish to do so.
I know we've already had this panel, but the concern of the Minister, who was very articulate, was that they're putting £4.2 billion of their settlement into rail, and they're of the opinion that the Secretary of State, of whichever political persuasion, shouldn't be able to make decisions without the consent of the Scottish Government, which seems reasonable to me.
We'll be coming on to questions about the devolved aspect in a minute. But before we get to that, Gavin, you wanted a quick supplementary.
Mr. Morrison, in one of his final supplementaries, asked one of the questions I was going to ask. But just to come back on the Minister, you made the point about you not wanting politicians to run railways. Nobody's saying that politicians should run railways. ScotRail, for instance, is publicly owned and operated and run by professionals like Mr. Hynes beside you. So it's not about politicians running train services. It's about getting best value for the passenger and the taxpayer. But that we'll come on to that later. But a quick question on the private sector involvement. Private investment in the rail system totaled just over £500 million in 22-23. Public investment totalled just short of £9 billion and about £7 billion for HS2. So if privatisation, franchising and the last 30 years of marketisation couldn't push private investment to barely a quarter of that put in by the public purse in the same year, even without looking at HS2, take that out of the equation altogether, why would a body, despite what you said earlier, that's slightly closer to the state and seen as an arm's length body, bring in any extra private capital?
Because again, I think some of the private sector counterparts that run our railway, and they do so effectively on a fee, which they get paid if they perform, their ability to be able to put more passenger services on, take more risk, is effectively stymied and checked by government that decides whether they can do that or not. And so the current system just doesn't really, they're effectively paid to run the existing service. The incentive to grow the service, think holistically, do things differently, is just no longer there in a way that it was previously under the franchise proposals or mechanism, where effectively they bought a X sort of year period contract, and anything they got that was north of the cost of that franchise was their profit. So therefore they had an incentive to grow the passenger numbers, and indeed those passenger numbers did grow over that time as well. And I think that's what we want to sort of see a change. We want to bring in better incentives so that the private sector will use their own balance sheet to invest and be a little more dynamic, and more so than it is right now.
Okay, thanks. We'll put a pin in the Scottish/devolved issues. We'll be back.
We'll be coming back to that.
I deduced from your face that Mr. Morris might be cantering over your territory.
Zara, if we could turn to you next.
Thank you, Chair. The Secretary of State's power to make regulations for rail markets at Clause 8 in the bill has been criticised by the Delegated Powers and the Regulatory Reform Committee in the House of Lords as being a skeleton clause without a clear justification. So why is it necessary to legislate in these terms now, and what would you say to address those concerns in the House of Lords?
But I hope I've sort of touched on this in parts, because there will be a requirement to keep the legislative body up to date, not least when I think the REUL regs end in 2026. So there will be a requirement to keep that book up to date. And if it's not done in the way that has been described here, then it will need to be done in primary legislation form. And I just don't believe that will allow the railway to be nimble enough and to give GBR the powers it needs to do to further develop the railway. They have to wait for legislation. So if the Secretary of State uses those powers, there'll be a requirement to consult. There'll be the checks and balances inside Parliament from an affirmative procedure. And so I believe we've got the balance right between the ability to change things and make those changes to allow the railway to continue to function in the manner it needs to, in a timely manner, but also the checks and balances that Parliament can give as well. But again, I came back to it. If the committee feels that there's a sort of tighter way to do it that doesn't take that flexibility and nimbleness away, then I'd be happy to look at those.
So why do you think then that the committee and the House of Lords have such concern that it is a skeleton clause?
Because I guess, notwithstanding the checks and balances that I just described, it's still secondary legislative power rather than primary. So, in that regard, I can understand why. But all I would ask the House of Lords to do is to take into account what's good about the running of the railway. And I believe what's good about the running of the railway is to be able to take ideas and suggestions as to how things can be done better, but because they impact on regulation, then they're going to require those changes to be made by the Secretary of State. And then in return for that, there are the checks and balances in place when the Secretary of State enacts those powers. And I know sort of during the Brexit period, there was always this concern about giving the executive too much control, and I think that's always a concern of Parliament that rightly is sort of jealous of powers of the legislature over the executive. But I firmly believe this is in the best interest of the railway to be able to give and grant these powers.
The Cape Town Convention was signed in 2001 and the Luxembourg Protocol in 2007. Why are you legislating on this now?
So the Cape Town Convention effectively brought in the type of flexibility for the private sector to encourage more private sector finance for aviation, and the Luxembourg Protocol would do the same for the railway, and particularly the financing of rolling stock. So this is the only provision within the draft legislation which impacts Northern Ireland, because it allows the government to legislate for the Luxembourg Protocol to then deliver the same benefits and try and get more investment ultimately into rolling stock manufacturers, as one could see from the Cape Town Convention on aviation. Did either of you want to
maybe just add a couple of points? So the Luxembourg Protocol came into force at the beginning of March. There's about 20 countries, I think, that have signed up to it. I think 4 have ratified it. So this is really around us ratifying it. The particular benefit of the Luxembourg Protocol, and I know some of your witnesses have had different views on whether it will bring benefit, is that it provides more certainty and clarity around means of legal redress around the financing of rolling stock. What one would expect that to do is to make the UK market more attractive and thus more competitive for rolling stock, so there's a sort of passenger benefit there, but also once we've ratified it, potentially make UK-based rolling stock companies more competitive in international markets. So that's the purpose of it.
The powers to make regulations implementing the convention and the protocol are quite broad. Why is it necessary that they are this broad?
That will be subject to consultation, though, once the actual protocol is put into that, given that effect. So it is it's almost a sort of forward-leaning power that's given, but once that power is actually utilised, it will itself require a consultation process, as sort of any legislation would. Not fair?
Yeah.
And so, do you think that it could be potentially more specific as we see it come down the line?
So I think that flexibility, as I say, added with the consultation requirement, actually then allows, and also once we have the ability to actually look at how it's being utilised in other parts of the globe where they're a little further ahead, will actually allow us to sort of bring the provisions into effect.
The breadth allows, which I would argue is only so you can ratify the Luxembourg Convention, but it's designed to make sure we can also reflect any outcome of consultation.
Kevin.
Thanks so much. Just quickly before I move on to the devolved situation, on the Luxembourg Protocol, following ratification of Luxembourg, would that mean that the IRB or Transport for Wales or any other body could potentially sign up to, and there's financial implications, sign up to Eurofema for to access finance in that way, or would that require further legislation, secondary or otherwise?
I don't know the answer to that. We'd have to write to you on that.
No, if you could.
I thought one variant would come up, and I said to Conrad, "Would you be able to cover that part?" But we didn't realise it would be that. We'll write to you. Sorry.
Sorry.
That's not a problem. Well, if rumours are to be believed, there'll be an election called today anyway, and this entire meeting is moot. But in terms of...
rumours happen every day.
Well, indeed.
They're like the end of the world.
Well, if we come back to the centre of the universe in Scotland, the situation obviously you may have heard some of the evidence that Cabinet Secretary Hyslop gave us this morning, and also that the Welsh Minister eloquently gave yesterday, is that there are, as Mr Morris has already alluded to, some genuine concerns, none of it driven from politics, just genuine concerns in terms of operation and what it might mean. So in terms of that, you've already referenced it yourself, Minister, in terms of the power to delegate functions in Clause 3, and Minister Hyslop said the engagement has been very good, so she had no complaints about the actual engagement per se itself. However, what specific engagement did you have before you drafted the power to delegate functions in Clause 3, and did you think it would ever be wanted by particularly the Scottish or Welsh governments, given the feedback we've had yesterday and today?
And again, I just want to stay on the record that ahead of issuing any directions or guidance, the Secretary of State would be expected to engage not just with the ORR and also obviously with GBR, but also with the devolved authorities that are going to be sort of relevant in terms of the use of that guidance or direction. So there is no, I don't believe there is anything that would actually cause the devolved responsibilities and powers to be watered down. The ability for the devolved authorities to put their own money into the railway still remains. And just in terms of the engagement, we had a really positive meeting with Fiona Hyslop, who was newer to post. I'd spoken to her predecessor as well, and she's quite clearly a person to be able to engage with and do business with. Where I left it with her was I said that if there was anything that she had specifically where she felt we could reflect and make it clearer, our commitment to the devolved authorities having their own powers to do as they wish, and where that might be interfered with unintentionally by another provision, then I'd happily take representations from her. And I know she's written to the committee and she's copied that to us as well. I'm due to be meeting up with her shortly, so I'll just make sure that covers the point for her as well.
Well, the kind of, I think you put it, the devolution back to the IRB in terms of the franchising power, which, so we're going to talk about hypothetically, because it's very unlikely, to be perfectly honest, that a Scottish Government or a Welsh Government would seek to do that, but it
could do. I mean, in the future, if the model... Yeah, I understand under the existing Scottish Government that's unlikely to, but in the event that another Scottish Government came in that wanted to go look at the sort of private sector competition...
Even for friends.
Well, I know you'll be doing everything in your body to make sure that doesn't occur, but we're trying to actually build a railway that works without the political choices, if you like. So therefore, it allows that flexibility.
But looking at that specific function, and it was brought up by the Cabinet Secretary this morning, if there was an issue, so if it was going back to RB and there was a franchise there that the Scottish Government, for whatever reason, had significant issues with, the Scottish Parliament couldn't revoke that licence, that franchise, to run that service as it stands. Is that something you'd consider looking at in terms of coming forward with a final version of the bill?
Yeah, and I wouldn't want Fiona to think I wasn't interested in her proceedings. I came in for Andrew and Peter. I was watching on the screen. And I heard her make that point because the language actually talks about granting, but actually then doesn't talk about revoking. And that struck a chord with me when she made that point. We'd have to look at that if that was a suggestion of hers or yours, and see if there was anything further we could do to provide any assurance. Alex, did you want to come in, given we're talking?
Well, I was just going to say that if the Scottish Government decided to delegate to GBR on franchising, then that would have to be on mutually acceptable terms, which would, of course, include, the award, the monitoring, and the situation in which you would revoke the operation of passenger services.
Yeah, it was. We should probably apologise to Mr. Hynes, because between the Secretary of State and the Chamber, and what we've said in the Chamber and then what we've said in Hustings, we've probably set the expectation level for a civil servant coming in higher than any civil servants had before in terms of the expectation on what sort of job he'll do. Because obviously Alex has had clearly experience for a number of years in running track as much as possible, obviously, given the current constraints, and running track and train together. But clearly, so I think I put it to Fiona earlier on as a journey that we can only get so far on because of the constraints. This bill comes in and allows the DFT to fully integrate track and train in England, but Scotland, who obviously started this process, won't be able to fully integrate track and train, given that the Scottish Rail network, apart from the few cross-border services, is much more kind of hived off and domestic than the rest of the network. Would it not make sense to devolve those functions to allow Scotland to have a fully integrated track and train approach?
I think this is one of these challenges where we're trying to created Great British Railways to bring together track and train across Great Britain. We are respecting the sort of devolved circumstances that exist, allowing the opportunity for those devolved authorities to come into that model as well, in the way that Alex just described. There will, of course, be a partnership approach with other devolved authorities, so particularly those where devolution deals have been done. But in order to integrate track and train, you actually want to sort of take away as much fragmentation as you possibly can.
But I understand that point, but that fragmentation nevertheless remains in Scotland. So
yeah, so the existing powers will exist in Scotland as they currently sit. My hope is that everyone across Great Britain will see the opportunities of freeing up the day-to-day operational powers, put it into the railway body, integrate track and train, meddle less, and then actually see a better improvement for the passenger as well. So I hope that Scotland, Wales will take the same opportunity that we're affording for England.
Well, on that, obviously the current situation is suboptimal, although clearly kind of new ways have been found to incorporate Scotland's ScotRail Alliance, Scotland's Railway, call it what you will. But the fear is that with this new body, given obviously the Scottish Government or the Scottish Parliament is responsible for the funding and setting out the strategy, etc., that this bill as drafted will give less accountability to Scottish Parliament and Scottish ministers for the rail sector in Scotland because of this new body that's potentially a bit more distant than the current arrangements. Is that not a genuine fear?
I don't believe so, but Alex, look, given your experience in Scotland, why don't you provide the reasons?
This draft bill doesn't meddle with the existing powers that the Scottish Government has.
Nor does it improve for the devolved administrations,
and which are very significant. And of course, as you rightly say, the Scottish Government use those powers to, for example, expect track and train to work together in an alliance. And the Scottish Government can point to many good things arising from that. Obviously, we're trying to create a coherent rail network for Great Britain here, and only the UK Government Secretary of State can do that, and has to look at all three nations of the UK affected by Great Britain.
And you say it doesn't devolve further. Again, I just come back, what we're devolving is the powers to Great British Railways. So to bring even more fragmentation in would be completely counterintuitive, given that we're actually trying to set up a body, give it the powers across track and train, and not have all of these different systems, which I don't believe work for the benefit of the passenger.
I think the other thing I would say is, and we heard it from Mr. Haines earlier on this morning, is that Network Rail and ScotRail, GBR and ScotRail in the future, can do a lot more within the existing legislation to integrate track and train. The ScotRail Alliance, which has been around for nearly a decade now, has had highs and lows. It's been thick and thin, and certainly I know that Network Rail and ScotRail and the Scottish Government are exploring opportunities to deepen the level of integration between track and train, and this draft bill doesn't get in the way of that.
Just back to the Minister, depending on which side of the border you're looking, one person's fragmentation is another's defragmentation, so it kind of depends on what prism you're viewing this particular issue through. Just one issue before I come back to my final question. Mr. Hynes, one of the issues the Scottish Government brought up in their written representation to us is that DIPTAC will be giving advice to the IRB when obviously you'll be aware and you'll have dealt with, over the years, you'll have dealt with MAX in Scotland, which is obviously the Scottish equivalent. So there's a request in there that MAX be allowed to, on the face of the bill, that MAX are also given representation to be given advice from a Scottish point of view. Is that something that you would consider, have any issue with?
Well, certainly we've seen Fiona Hyslop's representations in that regard, and I think we'll take that away in terms of what, as a minimum, the requirement for DIPTAC to consult.
So with
exactly.
Okay, fair enough. And quick last question from me. I think you said earlier that this is obviously a draft bill, and you're happy to go away and look at representations from Scottish Welsh governments and indeed the committee. So obviously at the moment one of the big issues is that the bill as drafted doesn't give the devolved ministers, Scottish Welsh, etc., moved up to Scotland because they have a lot more power than currently the Welsh government do, power to give directions or guidance to the IRB whatsoever. Is that something that could be looked at? That's a fundamental issue with the bill as it stands from a Scottish viewpoint.
I mean, as I said, we'll happily take both the points that Fiona makes directly to me. I've got to find out if there are any further to make, or actually the points that are made in the letter that we've seen that's been sent to the chair and the recommendations that the chair makes, and we'll take into account matters where we believe the bill can be strengthened and made better. As I say, it is not the intention at all to water down any powers at all. But don't want to get into a situation where we've got a bit of a sort of pick and mix approach to it. So I think as things stand at the moment, there is the ability for any devolved authority to be able to utilise the same GBR process that we're building here. At that time, as Alex was saying, that will be the opportunity to discuss how that will work. That strikes me as perhaps the best, because then you actually know what the model is that's being suggested, and then how to actually build it and how to unwind it if that needs to be put in place as well. So there might be something to be said for that flexibility as well. But if there are specific examples where the powers under this bill are undermining the existing devolved powers that have been established, then we'll obviously look at how that can be sort of countered by checks and balances and comfort.
Very quick on that last point. We've heard both the Welsh Government and the Scottish Government say that as drafted, the bill is not compatible with the devolution settlement. Is that something, again, you're going to have to look at to make sure that both governments are content that any final bill will be compatible with the devolution settlement?
This bill is not designed to unpick what's already been devolved. So if there are examples where the feeling is that that's not compatible, then that's not the intent at all. I recognise there's some grey areas, if I call it that, in terms of the Secretary of State taking matters with regards to direction and guidance, consulting, making sure that that consultation is strong enough. So I can see where we might need to look more closely at some concerns, but it's absolutely not the intention to unpick devolved powers. So that's on the sort of face of it. If there are specifics where the feeling is that it does do so, then we'll obviously look at them. Does that seem fair? Yep.
Graham, you wanted a very quick...
Very quickly, Conrad, you mentioned passenger service contracts earlier. In the explanatory notes it said the design of these will be finalised after GBR has been created. The contracts are being designed by the Department for Transport, Treasury and private operators, but under the legislation the Secretary of State will be able to instruct Great British Railways on whether it should make a direct award or go out to tender. Is that correct?
So it will be
direct awards.
It has to be correct, because if we are in a position still where it is not possible to go back to competition, then you would want GBR to be able to make direct awards in the same way that the Secretary of State can today.
But again, that's where we need to be quite clear as to who's making those decisions. So the framework's set up for that to run, but I don't foresee the Secretary of State getting involved in those decisions. The whole idea of moving the franchising and contracting powers from the Secretary of State to Great British Railways is so that Great British Railways team will make that decision, because they're the ones best placed to make it, Mr. Morris.
I'd like to conclude the session with very briefly asking two final questions. Firstly, my colleagues touched on the devolution points with regard to Scotland and Wales. We also had a session yesterday with the subnational transport bodies, and Transport in the North, Transport for the North in particular, are concerned that their current statutory relationship with the Secretary of State will be diminished with GBR, and the other STBs want to have a more formalised relationship with GBR. Are their concerns valid?
Well, we'll happily look at their concerns. Again, I would just say that whilst the aim is to integrate track and train and make it easier to make decisions, have incentives aligned, and not be so conflated as I believe the railway setup is at the moment, there is at the heart of the Williams review devolution in the form of partnerships. So this is very much a regional approach for GBR, set across the current regions that exist within Network Rail. And within that, there is the intent to form partnerships between GBR and those devolved authorities, bodies like Transport for the North. And of course, those where we've already gone sort of further with the sort of devolved settlements, then those will be the sort of first to make the partnerships. So I don't foresee any way where the existing powers will be diminished, but I'll just caution about making greater powers that are devolved on the basis of sort of particular devolve region boundaries, because I want the railway to be able to set what's best for railway boundaries. And sometimes there is that conflict between the political boundaries as to where voters are, but the railway goes beyond that, and I think that's really important, not least for freight, because freight goes beyond it as well. So I want this to be the opportunity for the railway to be put first, and for us to not to end one form of fragmentation and then deliver another form.
Okay. And my last question is on the ticketing platform that was initially envisaged for GBR, but you've decided is not required anymore. We've had evidence from some witnesses that actually having that central platform would enable greater private sector involvement in providing ticket retailing. Is it something you're willing to reconsider?
Well, the decision from the Secretary of State and from government was to proceed on the basis of having more retailers in place rather than one centralised GBR retailer, and so I can't see that being changed, because that decision was looked at in great depth and that was then made. I think where there is a case to be made is to ensure that we've got more data, more access to data, so we've got more competition, because at the moment there is one rather dominant player in place, and whilst that dominant player has been very helpful in terms of innovation, it's not healthy when you've got such a large share controlled by one entity. Conrad was more involved in this than I was, so perhaps I'll ask Conrad if he wants to say anything.
So I think, as the Minister said, the decision was taken that there was a risk that we ended up with a dominant public sector ticketing system alongside dominant players in the private sector, and it was felt that we'd be better able to encourage competition by avoiding creating that sort of public sector body. What we are still doing, and what's really critical though, I think, is working with the sector to look at how the sort of back office functions of the ticketing system, which are incredibly complicated, as the committee is very aware, are brought together in ways and made easier for new entrants to access, so the sort of cost of entry to the market becomes easier for private sector competitors, and we encourage that competition. So that's the work that we're now really focusing on.
That's very helpful, thank you. That concludes our session this morning. Long session with 3 panels. Can I thank the 3 of you very much indeed for your time and evidence this morning. Our job is now to go away and analyse all the points that have been made to us, and we will endeavour to come back with our report as quickly as we can. But for now, thank you again. Order.
The proceeding has ended. 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 The proceeding